So, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5 Golden Wind has finally gotten its first OP, Fighting Gold, by Coda. And hoo boy, is there a lot to unpack in this whole minute and a half. So let's go through the opening and discover every little Easter egg and foreshadowing that it has to offer. So we start off the OP with a statue of David reshaped into the pose that Giorno strikes on the cover of Volume 16 of Golden Wind, or Volume 62 of JoJo altogether. This is in reference to both the Rolling Stones arc, as not only is there a blink and you'll miss it scene where Rolling Stones itself actually appears in its Bruno form behind the statue of David, but also the fact that the statue of David is linked to the idea of binding fate, as it is what inspired Scalipi's stand and stand ability that is inescapable fate. And this binding fate is represented by the chains that cover it. These chains lead up to the Requiem arrow, showing 8 chains being bound to that specific arrow. This is because of the events of Rolling Stones and how Mista changed fate. These 8 chains are a result of Mista changing fate, and it represents all the major players of Part 5, that being the Passion gang, Giorno, though only one person will get their hands on the arrow, and it's made quite clear who the arrow will become part of, as it changes into the heart on the back of Giorno's ladybug, and that ladybug is the one that spells out the title, JoJo. And after a flashy title card sequence, which each of the backgrounds seems to represent one of the main cast, we get a shot of a bleeding hand, which, given the fact that the people who worked on this opening are the same ones who worked on the Evangelion opening, this shot seems oddly familiar. Now, given where the blood flows from, it's obvious that this is in reference to Giorno's fight with Bruno, as the blood that drips from his hand becomes the chains that bind their fate together. Though there's something else interesting that happens in this shot that I won't cover until I get to my predictions for the future changes to this opening. Then from here we transition to Mista, who is running forward in pursuit, likely representing his chase after Sail during the Sex Pistols arc, him also being completely surrounded by the chains of fate that we see all throughout this opening. Then, through the transition of Mista firing his weapon, we see Trish falling, as if she is a bullet being fired by Mista's gun. She falls downwards towards her doom, unable to break free from the chains of fate, these being represented by the 3 chains that surround her, likely symbols of Diavolo, Doppio, and Bruno. She falls until there is a transition cut to a sand sculpture of Abbacchio's partner's head smashing into the ground. Now there's a reason that the sculpture is made of sand, as it's supposed to represent 3 different things about Abbacchio. First, you have the fact that the sand comes from an hourglass, and Abbacchio's ability is to rewind the clock in a sense. Then you also have the fact that the sculpture is a face or a bust that represents the bust that Abbacchio is able to make for the gang of Diavolo's face before he passes. And then finally you have the sand that represents Abbacchio's time literally running out as it flows to the bottom of the hourglass. And this same hourglass has King Crimson-esque designs on the handles of it, so we know for a fact that this is what it's supposed to be representing. And as the sand falls down, it becomes the same chains of fate that bind everyone together. Then you have the chains cutting to Narancia, who's falling backwards. Each chain that passes him is someone he's met thanks to Passion. Each colored background is supposed to represent who that chain is supposed to be, until he himself passes from his body, much like when his soul leaves during the Chariot Requiem arc, walking off into the afterlife. We then hard cut into Fugo, who has his face being mirrored, reflecting both his fight in the Man in the Mirror arc, but also his internal conflict with his own stand, which he hates, until a silhouetted version of himself stands in between them 2 mirrored images. Then, the chain that represents him exits the opposite way of the rest of the chains that appear in the next scene with Bruno, going up instead of down, reflecting his departure from the story and the group. Next we cut to Bruno, who is walking forward with a determined look on his face, likely him about to encounter Diavolo for the first time. Each chain that passes him is a remaining member of the gang, though as he walks he starts to silhouette out a bit, but that doesn't stop him from moving and he keeps marching on, likely a reflection of how when he dies, his body continues to march on and progress with the mission. Then from here, each silhouette of the characters that we've seen so far break away to reveal their stands. Now, except for Mista, who is the one responsible for causing everything that happened in Part 5, including all of his friends' death. He gets to stay in his silhouetted form because he's a naughty boy. Sit in the corner, Mista, and think about what you did. Then the hand of Giorno reaches out and touches the chains that bound the cast together, turning them into beautiful living vines, thus changing the binds of fate and waking these sleeping slaves, which in turn is represented by everyone performing attacks from their most memorable arcs. First with Mista firing off a bullet against Sail and redirecting it with Sex Pistols. Then you have Abbacchio just narrowly avoiding that bullet and rewinding it with Moody Blues, which then in turn turns the background into a cylinder-like structure in the shape of a reticle. And then enters Aerosmith, aka Little Bomber, firing off shots. And this background looks an awful lot like the sewers that Narancia chases Formaggio in during the Little Feet arc. Also, all the bullets that Little Bomber fires throughout this entire segment end up turning into Bruno zippers, showing the connection between Narancia and Bruno. Along with this, how Little Bomber lands on Narancia is exactly like it does in the Clash vs. Talking Head fight. And then from there, the smoke that kicks up from Little Bomber's landing enters Fugo, Fugo, whose rage builds up until a stand appears behind him and slams its fists together, creating a cloud of purple haze smoke, which then dissipates and reveals Bruno, who turns slightly and enters from above with sticky fingers, much like how he does during the Grateful Dead arc. With an arrivederci, the zipper transitions into the next shot, and it's actually my favorite shot in the entire opening. It's White Album Diavolo cowering under his hobo blanket while Giorno's pedals surround him, until we pull in close and realize that it's actually Trish, which is great, as it shows a family connection between Diavolo and Trish while hiding the identity of the man who's really under the cloth to the viewers until they reach the White Album arc, while also showing us that the girl who is in this shot is hiding for a reason. It's just a great bunch of information compacted into one little scene, and I love it. Then from here we have a shot of all the main cast and their profiles sitting next to 6 separate gang stars glowing brightly in the night sky, playing into the message that their memories will never be forgotten. And then from here the cast walks off into the light, the chains of fate crumbling behind them, and what looks like a shadowy pillar collapses behind that. This is possibly a representation of the collapsing erased time at the end of part 5. And thus the opening ends on a final shot of the metallic stamp that we see at the end of part 5's manga as well. Though if you think this is where the analysis is done, then I'm about to blast your ass back to the past all bites the dust, because each of these scenes that I was talking about also have a double meaning to them. First, of course, we're going to start with Giorno, whose bleeding hand is also in reference to his first fight with Bruno, along with being the final fight against Diavolo, using the blood drop technique to predict time skip. Then you have Mista, who appears to be pursuing Sail, but when you reinterpret it, it's him pursuing Chariot Requiem as Diavolo, which also explains why his silhouette is the only one that continues to move while the others freeze in place. Along with this, the transition from Mista to Trish is in reference to their soul swap during the Chariot Requiem arc. Then you have Trish's scenes, which were one of the only ones that stays basically the same all the way through. But you also have the fact that before she hits the ground, the chains around her disappear. This is because she's one of the only survivors of part 5, therefore she's an awoken sleeping slave, meaning that the chains that bind her no longer exist. And then you have a Bacchio scene, which is the most obvious, of course. It's the fact that the head of his partner is made of the sand that is a representation of his ability, which his partner is the reason he got the ability, along with the fact that the last person he sees before he dies is his partner, and that the sand is his life ticking away. Then you have Narancia's scenes, which I don't think has too much change from a second perspective. A lot of it's just the same, as his is very simple, but if you do notice something, feel free to tell me about it. But then you get to Fugo's scene, which possibly hints at the inclusion of Golden Heart, Golden Ring, and its traitor symbolism in the story altogether, which, if that happens, I'm telling you right now, I'm gonna hell a nut. Then, of course, you obviously have Bruno and him soldiering on through every fight that he has. Each chain that passes him is a fight that he partakes in, be it him against Giorno, him against Grateful Dead, him against King Crimson, him against Oasis. Bruno's always moving forward, never letting anything stop him. And then finally, we have the very end, where all of them stand next to their gang stars in the sky. Everyone on the right dies, everyone on the left survives. I absolutely love this opening and Fighting Gold. It's my personal favorite opening from JoJo so far, but I am also extremely biased in this regards, and I am not giving any of the other openings a fair shot at all, because I love part 5. I also feel like a lot of this opening's power is connected to the fact that they were working with the same people who made the Evangelion opening, as the structure compared side by side looks very similar. Though, what is a JoJo opening without some changes down the line? If I had to guess, I would assume if we're not going to get any more openings for the rest of the part, which is very possible, they haven't confirmed any more openings, that they are going to change things every now and then, and I feel like I know the exact moments where they're going to change them. First, of course, you have every time that a silhouette appears by itself, as I feel like these were placed in here much like some of the scenes from the second opening of part 3 were placed, with Sonochi Kyoku having a lot of open spaces left for the end of the world variant to come in and spice up the scene. And I would expect to start noticing these changes in Fighting Gold around the G and Guts area of the story. And I feel some of the moments that will receive changes are likely something related to the character's demise in a sense. First, maybe Abakio, instead of having sand pouring from his hands, it's the blood from the gaping hole in his stomach. Along with Bruno maybe looking more and more dead inside as each chain passes him. And then for correcting the opening and changing all of the negative aspects that happen in it, every scene with a flower petal, Gold Experience Requiem or Giorno comes in and fixes that moment, as it appears to only really specifically happen when Giorno is in danger or Diavolo is on screen at all. And the last major change I see possibly happening is that they open up the backgrounds from their extract art into scenery from Italy. Though I wouldn't expect this too much, and I wouldn't expect it until the very final version of the opening. Now, of course, there are things I might have missed when going through this opening. I went through it about 15 different times, like 10 of those times I was going through it in slow motion, so I might have just barely missed something, but it's always possible. And if you notice something that I didn't, feel free to hit me up about it. And here's hoping that if we get another opening in Part 5 that is on the same level as Fighting Gold. And if you enjoyed this video and like to support more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MannyAnotherBadGuy. And if you want to go out of your way and fight some gold yourself, you can head on over to funimation.com/show/Shimonetta, boring world where the country jokes doesn't exist. Buy yourself a copy of Shimonetta and defeat Diavolo.